We grew up hearing stories about secret quilts and hidden tunnels guiding enslaved people to freedom. But the real events behind what actually happened when black slaves tried to escape are nothing like the legend. Fewer than 1 in 1,000 ever made it out, not because they lacked courage, but because their every step was hunted by patrols, bloodhounds, and a system designed to destroy hope. Escaping wasn't a journey through a kindly network. It was a fight against surveillance, betrayal, and brutal punishment, with failure meaning whippings, branding, mutilation, or worse. So, what did escape really look like? And how did the myth take hold? The truth shatters everything you thought you knew. Quilt patterns with names like Flying Geese and Drunkard's Path have become symbols of secret codes, supposedly stitched by enslaved women to point the way to freedom. For years, stories have claimed that certain designs meant head north or wait for help, and that these quilts hung on fences or windows like silent beacons to escaping slaves. The idea is so vivid, it has found its way into textbooks, children's books, and even museum tours. But the first book to describe a systematic quilt code did not appear until the 1990s, more than a century after the Civil War. No diaries, letters, or newspaper accounts from the era mention coded quilts, and historians searching plantation records and abolitionist correspondence have found only silence. The legend grew in the space left by that silence, embroidered with every retelling. Tunnels are another favorite detail. Across towns in the north, local legends point to root cellars, old basements, or bricked-up passages as proof of a hidden railway beneath the streets. But nearly all of these so-called underground railroad tunnels date to renovations after the Civil War, built for plumbing, coal delivery, or simply as storm drains. Not one has been documented in antebellum records as a purpose-built escape route. In fact, most freedom seekers traveled above ground, moving by foot, wagon, or riverboat, relying on darkness and their own wits rather than secret passages. The real story is far less theatrical, but it is also more revealing. The truth is not stitched into fabric or buried under city streets. It is found in the choices people made, the risks they took, and the ordinary landscapes they crossed in search of freedom. Stories of the Underground Railroad often shine a lantern in the night, a white station master on a hill, signaling safety to the lost. In children's books and early movies, these figures step forward as the main heroes: the Quaker woman opening her door, the farmer hiding fugitives in his barn, the kindly conductor guiding the way north. Lanterns hung in windows, secret knocks at midnight, coded phrases whispered at the gate. These details give the legend a familiar cast. The term station master itself, now central to the lore, wasn't widely used until decades after the Civil War, when the real events had already faded into memory. These tales offer comfort. The idea that a network of brave, mostly white, helpers stood ready at every turn, turning the journey to freedom into a series of handoffs from one safe house to the next. The narrative centers on the saviors, not the people running for their lives. In the most popular retellings, fugitives are often nameless, rescued by the courage and moral clarity of outsiders who risked everything for justice. This version of the story found its way into school curriculums, museum exhibits, and public monuments. It's a story that reassures, suggesting that help was always close by, and that good people could tip the balance against a brutal system. But the real history is less tidy. The lanterns and secret signals make for good folklore, but they rarely tell us whose courage actually made the difference, or how often freedom was a matter of luck, quick thinking, and the desperate hope that someone, anyone, might answer a knock in the dark. Out of nearly 4 million enslaved people in the United States before the Civil War, only a tiny fraction ever reached permanent freedom by escape. Historians estimate that each year, the number of people who managed to run away and stay free fell somewhere between 1,000 and 5,000. That's less than 0.1% of the enslaved population, a rate so low it barely registers against the scale of slavery itself. Most who attempted flight were caught within days, their absence reported in newspapers alongside detailed descriptions and promised rewards. Slaveholders rarely offered more than 5 or 10% of a person's value for their return, confident that patrols, bloodhounds, and local networks would do the rest. The odds were stacked at every turn. To reach free territory, a person might need to travel hundreds of miles, often on foot, without maps or money. Most plantations sat deep within slave states, far from any border. Even in the Upper South, where the journey north was shorter, the risk of capture was constant. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act meant that crossing into a free state no longer guaranteed safety. Runaways could be seized and sent back from Boston, Philadelphia, or Chicago as easily as from the fields of Virginia. The numbers tell a blunt story. In Virginia alone, over 70 years, advertisements for missing men outnumbered those for women by nearly 6 to 1. Most who tried to run were young men in their teens or 20s, those with the stamina to walk for days, the strength to climb fences, and the nerve to slip past patrols in the dark. Skilled workers like blacksmiths, carpenters, and house servants appeared in runaway ads more often than their share of the population, their trades giving them both the means to blend in and the knowledge to plan a route. Family ties made escape even rarer. Mothers with children faced impossible choices, and most stayed rather than risk separation. A married man might run only when he knew his wife had already been sold away, or when the threat of sale loomed over his own head. For most, the barriers were simply too high. The annual number of successful escapes, at best a few thousand, remained steady for decades, never rising above a statistical whisper. The reality was clear. The path to freedom was not just dangerous. For almost everyone in bondage, it was nearly impossible. A person fleeing slavery in the Deep South faced a journey that could stretch for hundreds of miles, often through hostile and unfamiliar terrain. The distance from Natchez, Mississippi to the Ohio River, a symbolic border between slavery and freedom, measured nearly 600 miles. That route cut through dense forests, swamps, and farmland with no reliable maps and few natural landmarks to guide the way. Most escapees traveled on foot, moving at night to avoid detection and hiding by day in thickets or abandoned barns. Rivers like the Mississippi and the Tennessee offered both opportunity and danger. A fast current could carry someone north, but the banks were watched, and ferrymen were often paid to report anyone who looked out of place. Every county in the slave states maintained patrol ordinances requiring white men to serve on slave patrols. These patrols, sometimes called paddy rollers, roamed rural roads and river crossings, stopping black travelers and demanding to see papers. Anyone found without written permission from an owner could be arrested on the spot. The patrols were supported by a network of informants, overseers, poor whites, even other enslaved people coerced into betraying runaways under threat of punishment. Bloodhounds became a feature of the Southern dragnet by the 1830s. Planters imported Cuban and Southern European breeds and spent years training them to track the scent of black fugitives. The dogs were kept hungry and taught to associate the smell of sweat and fear with the promise of food or reward. Once unleashed, these hounds could follow a trail for miles, ignoring the tracks of white men and focusing only on the scent they'd been trained to hunt. James Williams, who escaped Alabama in the 1830s, described how handlers forced the dogs to chase and attack enslaved people during drills, turning them into implacable enemies. The legal system reinforced the physical barriers. Black people traveling alone were presumed to be runaways unless they carried official freedom papers, which could be seized or destroyed by any white person. Towns posted rewards for information, sometimes just a few dollars, but enough to tempt a farmhand or ferryman into reporting a stranger. In cities, police and private guards patrolled docks, rail yards, and stagecoach stations, watching for anyone who didn't fit the local patterns of movement. The landscape itself offered few places to hide. Open fields left a person exposed to anyone passing by. Swamps and thick woods provided cover, but also brought the risk of snakes, insects, and starvation. Even the weather could become an enemy. Heavy rains washed away tracks, but turned creeks into impassable barriers. For those who lived near the border states, the journey might last a week. For others, it could stretch into months, with each mile bringing new dangers and no guarantee of help ahead. The physical and human obstacles worked together, forming a dragnet that caught most before they ever saw the river that marked the edge of slavery. Runaway advertisements tell a blunt story. Most people who managed to escape slavery were young men, usually in their late teens or 20s. The records show a clear pattern. Out of thousands of documented runaways in Virginia, over 70 years, men outnumbered women nearly 6 to 1. The reasons run deeper than just physical strength. Young men were less likely to have children or a spouse to leave behind, and they were often assigned work that took them beyond the plantation, hauling goods, tending livestock, or learning trades like blacksmithing and carpentry. These jobs gave them knowledge of the local landscape and sometimes even allowed them to travel between towns, picking up bits of information that could mean the difference between freedom and capture. Skilled workers stood out in the data. Carpenters, blacksmiths, coopers, and shoemakers appeared in runaway ads far more often than their share of the enslaved population. A skilled man could blend into a free black community, find work, and sometimes even pass as free. House servants, too, had advantages: access to news, overheard conversations, and a better sense of geography from errands in town. These connections and skills offered a slim edge, but for many, it was enough to try. Women and families faced even heavier odds. Most enslaved women began having children as teenagers, and the reality of escape with infants or small children was almost impossible. Ads for missing women were rare, and when they did appear, they often described someone running to join a husband or child who had already been sold away. Married men sometimes ran, but only when the threat of sale loomed or after being separated from their families. The data from North Carolina and other states lines up. The majority of runaways were single, young, and male. Escape from deep in the South required more than courage. The further a plantation sat from free soil, the more likely it was that only the strongest, most resourceful individuals would even attempt the journey. Older people rarely tried. The physical demands and the risk of permanent separation from kin were too great. For most, the cost of running was simply too high. Successful flight was a rare achievement, shaped by youth, skill, and the hard calculus of who had the least to lose. Ellen Craft stood in front of the mirror, her face nearly as pale as her nerves. She wrapped a handkerchief high under her chin, tied it above her head, and slipped on a pair of green spectacles. A heavy coat and a top hat completed the transformation. To anyone glancing her way, Ellen was no longer a young black woman from Macon, Georgia. She was a sickly white gentleman, traveling north for his health, with his attentive slave, her husband William, by his side. Their plan hinged on the small details. Ellen's right arm in a sling, so she could claim she was unable to sign her name. Her limp and cane, which discouraged close inspection. Her silence, explained away by feigned deafness. In December 1848, the Crafts boarded a train heading out of Macon. Ellen took a seat in the whites-only car, her disguise so convincing that conductors and fellow passengers showed her every courtesy. William played his role as the devoted servant, carrying bags and answering questions with practiced humility. Each stop brought new dangers. In Savannah, a ticket agent hesitated, asking Ellen, still in character as the ailing master, to sign for their next leg. Ellen, heart pounding, motioned to her supposed injury and asked the agent to sign for her. The man balked, but a friendly passenger intervened, vouching for the invalid gentleman. The signature was made. They pressed on, by steamer to Charleston, then by train through the Carolinas and Virginia. At every turn, the risk of exposure loomed. A single slip, a wrong word, a glance held too long, could mean arrest, violence, or sail further south. Yet the crafts kept moving, blending into a world that would have destroyed them if it knew who they were. Their journey spanned more than 1,000 miles, from the heart of Georgia to the free air of Philadelphia. At Christmas, while the South celebrated, Ellen and William Craft stepped off the train into freedom. Their escape, built on improvisation and nerve, was not just a flight from bondage. It was a performance, one that turned the rules of race, gender, and power inside out. For every story of tunnels and lanterns, there was a journey like the Crafts. No secret code, no hidden passage, just two people risking everything, trusting their wits, and betting their lives on a disguise and a hope. Henry Brown stared at the wooden crate, measuring just 3 feet long, 2 feet wide, and 2.5 feet deep. There was barely enough room to curl his body inside. He asked his friend, Samuel Smith, to hammer the lid shut, drive 3 small holes through the top, and label the box, "This side up with care." Brown's escape plan was as stark as it was desperate: ship himself from slavery in Richmond, Virginia, to freedom in Philadelphia, by mail. He packed a small flask of water, a handful of biscuits, and a single bladder for relief. The rest was left to luck, faith, and the schedules of Adams Express. The journey began before dawn on March 23, 1849. Brown's box was loaded onto a wagon, then transferred to a steam train, a riverboat, another wagon, and finally a second train. Each transfer risked exposure. At one stop, handlers flipped the crate upside down for hours, cutting off what little air he had. Brown later described the pressure in his head as nearly unbearable, his eyes swelling, veins bulging, and consciousness slipping in and out. He could hear voices and footsteps, sometimes laughing, sometimes cursing, never knowing if the next jolt would mean discovery or deliverance. Adams Express was known for speed, but the trip stretched to 26 hours. The box was jolted, dropped, and even rolled end over end. Brown's only companions were darkness, thirst, and the sound of his own heartbeat. The 3 air holes barely kept him alive. At one point, the box was left in a warehouse, surrounded by crates of dry goods. Nobody guessed a living man was hidden inside. When the crate finally arrived at the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Society office, abolitionists James Miller McKim, William Still, and others pried open the lid. Brown unfolded himself, stiff and drenched in sweat, and sang a hymn of thanksgiving. The men called him Box Brown from that day forward. His story spread quickly, a living rebuke to the slave system's security and a lesson in the lengths a person would go to claim their own body. Brown's escape was not just a feat of endurance, it was a blueprint for radical self-deliverance, born from the logic of a world that boxed in every hope. For every Henry Brown, there were hundreds of others who tried, failed, or died unseen. But on that day, one man's gamble with a shipping label and 3 air holes cracked open the myth that freedom was out of reach. A runaway advertisement from the Mississippi Gazette described a man with his back, very much scarred with the whip, and branded on the thigh and hips in 3 or 4 places. These were not isolated cases. Whipping stood as the most common punishment for those caught trying to escape, carried out with leather straps, rawhide, or even the twisted roots of trees. Overseers delivered lash after lash, sometimes in front of the entire enslaved community. Scars left deep welts that could be seen for years, and in many cases, these marks became part of a person's identity, so much so that slaveholders listed them in newspaper ads to help bounty hunters identify runaways. Branding was another tool of terror. Hot irons pressed against flesh left permanent initials, sometimes on the thigh, sometimes on the cheek or chest. In 1806, Benjamin Farrar placed a $20 reward for Sam, branded on the breast BF. George C. Purvis described Harry, a noted runaway, as being branded GP. The letters seared into skin were meant to make escapees easier to track, but also to broadcast their punishment to anyone who saw them. Some owners went further. A man named Reuben was branded on the face with the words, "A slave for life." Amputation was reserved for those labeled incorrigible. Notices described missing ears, cropped close to the skull, or fingers and toes cut away. These injuries served 2 purposes. They made running harder the next time, and they turned the body into a living warning. A person missing an ear or bearing a branded cheek could not hide their past, even if they reached a free state. Some advertisements even noted missing teeth, knocked out as punishment or lost to a blow, offering them as identifying features for slave catchers. The message was clear. The cost of failure was written into the flesh. Every scar, every brand, every missing part became both a mark of survival and a threat to anyone who considered following the same path. The body itself became a ledger, tallying both the risks and the price of running. Night fell over Washington, D.C. on April 15, 1848, as 77 enslaved men, women, and children slipped away from homes, hotels, and kitchens across the city. They moved quietly, some carrying infants, others clutching bundles of food or spare shoes, all making for the Potomac Wharf. Their plan was bold. A schooner called the Pearl would carry them 225 miles by water, down the Potomac and up the Chesapeake Bay, toward freedom in New Jersey. The operation had taken months to organize, with free black activists like Paul Jennings and Paul Edmondson recruiting escapees, and white abolitionists arranging the vessel and its crew. The Pearl's captain, Daniel Drayton, waited at the dock as the group boarded under cover of darkness. By midnight, the ship eased into the current, its sails catching a stiff spring wind. But by dawn, the weather turned. Headwinds pinned the schooner in place for nearly 2 days, keeping them within reach of the city they'd risked everything to leave behind. Word of the mass disappearance spread quickly. Enraged slaveholders formed a posse, chartered a steamboat, and armed themselves for pursuit. On the morning of April 18th, they found the Pearl anchored near the mouth of the Potomac, surrounded the vessel, and stormed aboard. The escapees, outnumbered and unarmed, had no chance to resist. The return to Washington was public and punishing. Crowds lined the docks to gawk and jeer as the captives were marched off the boat in chains. For days, mobs roamed the city, smashing the offices of anti-slavery newspapers and threatening anyone suspected of sympathy. The city's free black community hunkered down, fearing raids and reprisals. Most of the Pearl's passengers were sold to traders and shipped south, scattered across plantations in Louisiana and Mississippi, separated from families and the only home they'd ever known. The men who had tried to help faced their own reckoning. Drayton and his crew were jailed, facing fines that totaled $10,000, an impossible sum. The message was clear. Any attempt at mass escape would be met with overwhelming force, and those who aided fugitives would pay dearly. The Pearl Incident became a warning, not just to those who dreamed of freedom, but to the entire city. A reminder that the system of slavery could reach anyone, anywhere, at any time. A January morning in 1856, the Ohio River lay frozen solid, its surface split by a line of footprints heading north. Margaret Garner, her husband Robert, their 4 children, and a small group of relatives had crossed from Kentucky to Cincinnati in the coldest winter in 60 years. They reached the home of Margaret's cousin, Elijah Kite, believing they'd made it to safety. But word spread quickly. Within hours, U.S. Marshals and slave catchers surrounded the house. Margaret faced a choice no mother should ever have to make. As the officers battered down the door, Margaret seized a butcher knife. She turned first to her 2-year-old daughter, Mary, and killed her rather than see her returned to slavery. She wounded her other children, preparing to take their lives as well, but was stopped before she could finish. The room filled with shouts and chaos. The Garners were dragged back into custody, and the story swept through Cincinnati like a fever. The legal battle that followed became the longest fugitive slave case of the era. For weeks, the courtroom overflowed with reporters, abolitionists, and slave catchers. The question before the court was brutal in its simplicity. Was Margaret a person who could be tried for murder under Ohio law, or was she property to be returned to her owner under the Fugitive Slave Act? Lucy Stone, the abolitionist, testified about the children's pale skin, calling attention to the reality of sexual violence on southern plantations. Newspaper accounts described the children as almost white, hinting at the abuses Margaret had endured. In the end, the judge ruled that federal law took precedence. Margaret, her surviving children, and her husband were sent back to Kentucky, then sold farther south. Her act, killing her own child to spare her from slavery, became a rallying cry for abolitionists. Court transcripts, Stone's testimony, and the headlines of the day captured the horror and the impossible choices forced by a system that claimed both body and soul. Margaret Garner's name would echo in sermons, novels, and protest speeches for years to come, a stark reminder of what slavery demanded and what some were willing to do to defy it. William still kept a ledger in his Philadelphia office, its pages filled with the names and stories of people who risked everything for freedom. He wasn't just a record keeper. Still was part of a vigilant network of free black men and women who watched the docks, the train stations, and the courtrooms, ready to act when opportunity or danger appeared. These vigilance committees, operating in cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and Syracuse, organized legal defense, raised funds, and coordinated safe houses. Their members faced arrest, violence, and constant surveillance. Still's Minute Book, now preserved in the archives, lists hundreds of arrivals, each entry a testament to the quiet discipline and steady nerve required to keep the railroad running. Jane Johnson's story began on a steamboat in July 1855. She was enslaved by John H. Wheeler, a U.S. diplomat, who brought her and her 2 sons north as he traveled to Nicaragua. In Philadelphia, Johnson learned from local black dock workers that Pennsylvania law recognized her freedom the moment she touched state soil. She made her decision quickly. With the help of Still and the Vigilance Committee, she and her sons slipped away from Wheeler on a ferry, vanishing into the city's black community. Wheeler accused Still and his allies of abduction, and the case landed in court. In a dramatic twist, Johnson risked her own safety to return and testify for the men who had helped her. With the courtroom packed and tensions high, her calm testimony swayed the jury. The rescuers were acquitted, and Johnson's choice to speak for herself became a legend in abolitionist circles. These were not isolated acts of charity or chance. free black communities built their own networks of protection, sometimes formal, sometimes improvised, using churches, meeting halls, and kitchens as safe spaces. Their vigilance was not just about shelter, it was about defending the right to self-determination, even when the law and the streets were hostile. The Underground Railroad's true backbone was this daily, organized resistance, black-led, often unsung, and always at risk. A broken hoe left in the field, a cotton basket with a hidden tear, a cough that lingers just long enough to miss another row. These were the weapons of everyday war. On plantations across the South, resistance took root in small acts woven into the rhythm of forced labor. Enslaved people slowed their pace, swapped seeds, or let a fence post rot in the ground. A snapped plow or a mule that refused to move could cost a master a day's profit, and no overseer could watch every hand at once. Some learned to fake illness so convincingly that doctors could only shrug. Others stole moments to teach a child the letters scratched in dust, risking 39 lashes for every word. In the woods behind the cabins, secret gatherings became makeshift classrooms. An older man tracing the alphabet with a stick, a young woman whispering lines from a tattered Bible by firelight. Knowledge moved from hand to hand, hidden in songs or shared at dusk when the fields fell quiet. Even the smallest theft, a sweet potato, a scrap of cloth, became an act of defiance. These daily choices didn't make headlines or fill the pages of abolitionist newspapers, but they chipped away at the system's foundation. In every broken tool, every lesson shared in secret, the fight for dignity carried on, shaping a quiet rebellion that stretched from the fields to the quarters and back again. Crossing into free territory did not bring the certainty of safety. In northern cities, escapees found themselves in a world that looked nothing like the promised land of abolitionist sermons. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant that freedom could vanish with a knock at the door or a wrong turn down a city street. Federal commissioners, paid by the case, decided fates with a ledger and a pen. $10 if they ruled the person a fugitive, $5 if they let them go. That price difference hung over every hearing, tilting the scales toward return. A free black man walking to work in Philadelphia might be seized on suspicion alone, unable to testify in his own defense. Even in Boston or Chicago, a person who had survived the journey north could be dragged before a commissioner and sent back south on the word of a claimant. Jobs were hard to find, wages were low, and the fear of betrayal was constant. Some who made it to Canada wrote back about the cold, the loneliness, and the ache of families left behind. For many, freedom meant starting over, always looking over their shoulder, always wondering if the next stranger on the street was a friend or a hunter. The shadow of slavery stretched north, touching every part of a life rebuilt from scratch. Out of nearly 4 million enslaved people in America, fewer than 0.1% escaped to lasting freedom each year, according to census data and Vigilance Society records. The Underground Railroad was not a vast, coordinated network, but a patchwork of brave individuals, many of them black, risking everything to help others. Most who tried to escape relied on their own skill and the quiet courage of those around them. Documents show the consequences for failure were severe: public whippings, branding, sale further south, and family separation. Even those who reached the north faced legal threats under the Fugitive Slave Act and constant fear of recapture. Historians continue to debate how many stories remain undocumented, and many details about secret routes and helpers are lost to time. Yet the evidence is clear. Resistance took many forms, from sabotage to secret schools, defying a system built to erase hope. The struggle for freedom reshaped American law and society, and the fight for dignity and rights did not end at the border of so-called free states.